Picture this, you frame the perfect shot, nail the composition, only to press the shutter and zoom in and blur. Sound familiar? Don't worry, I have the ultimate solution, the Hasselblad H6D 100C, and it's only $33,000. Oh, and you'll also need the 90mm portrait lens. It's only $4,300. Then unlock my exclusive proprietary AI-powered focus mode that guarantees razor-sharp images every time. Coming soon. Just kidding. But let's actually fix your sharpness issues without breaking the bank. Nothing's more frustrating than missing the mark on sharpness, especially when everything else in your photo is spot on. Today, we're breaking down exactly how to get tack-sharp photos every time, no matter what camera or lens you're using. I am going to touch on gear, but that's not always the problem. I'm also going to talk about focus settings, camera stability, post-production, and other practical tips for sharp images. And be sure to subscribe because in my next video, I'll dive deeper into this topic with videos on how to nail focus in low light specifically, and how to get the sharpest photos with any lens. This whole series was sparked by some comments on a previous video, so thanks to you all for being here and helping everyone learn. I'm Brenda Bergering, a professional photographer and videographer, here to share practical tips to help you level up your photography skills. So let's start first with the gear factor. Let me be honest with you so that you can be honest with yourself. Gear is a factor when it comes to getting sharp images. Those blurry historical photos you have aren't blurry because it makes them more nostalgic. They're blurry in today's standards because camera gear has gotten so much better. For example, with old cameras, people were focusing manually, and it was harder to achieve sharpness, especially in fast-moving environments. Just over 7 years ago, I used to struggle with getting sharp photos, and the biggest and easiest change that I made was upgrading my camera gear. To determine if your gear is the problem, consider if you're using a modern setup. Everything else I'm going to talk about in this video will still help you regardless of what gear you're using. But sometimes if you're doing everything else right, it's about the gear and the limitations of your equipment. In the last 5 years or so, autofocus with second and third generation mirrorless cameras has gotten really good. We used to shoot with the Canon 5D Mark II, which is a great camera that takes great pictures, but it does struggle to nail the focus in low light. To give you an example, it had 9 focus points, and it would sometimes select the wrong thing to focus on. When the Canon R5 was released 12 years later in 2020, it had nearly 6,000 focus points in comparison. So 2008 to 2020, it goes from 9 to 6,000 focus points, covering almost 100% of the frame at that point. We actually switched to Sony in 2018, and suddenly I could track my subjects and even track my subject's eyes specifically with 100 times the number of focus points my previous camera had. At that point, many of my remaining sharpness issues went away. Now, as long as you're buying a camera that's at least 5 to 7 years old, whether it's a top-of-the-line camera or a beginner camera, you're likely going to have great autofocus. Next, when it comes to your lenses, it's more of a quality factor. There are lenses that are known to be really bad, often the cheaper ones, and others that are known to be very good when it comes to focus, often the more expensive ones. And occasionally there are affordable lenses that have great sharpness. So it's up to you to find the balance of those, and you can always review some of Mark's gear reviews on choosing the best lenses for you. We even had an ongoing problem one time where one of our lenses was calibrated incorrectly, and nailing sharpness was impossible with that lens. I still have anxiety about this sometimes and will revert to my old habit of double checking that I nailed the sharpness before moving on to the next scene. However, sharpness is rarely, if ever, a problem for me anymore. So let's move on to talk about beyond gear, why, and what you can do to make your photos sharper. So next up is focus settings. First things first, your focus needs to be precise. Autofocus is amazing, but it's not foolproof. Your camera has focus area and focus modes. For focus mode, we like AFC, continuous autofocus, using back button focus. This allows us to hold the focus on where we place our focus area by holding the back button. And then we can move our camera or adjust our framing. It will continually adjust to be focused on that focused area that we choose. This allows us to control what we're focusing on without any unexpected focus jumps where we don't want it, which might happen if your shutter is your focus button. Because when you press it, every time you take a picture, it's refocusing versus using the back button, you're using the back button to control where your focus is. If you want to know more about how to use this focus mode and back button focus, let me know in the comments and I can always do a dedicated video on it. For focus area, we use spot or single point autofocus. Letting your camera choose focus points can be a recipe for disaster. So selecting a single point and placing it exactly where you want sharpness helps you control what area is in focus. You can set up your camera so that you can move that focus area around. For example, if you know you want your subject on the left middle of the frame, you can move your focus point there and then use back button focus on AFC. For portraits, you can focus on the eyes. If the eyes are sharp, the whole image feels sharp. Some cameras even have eye tracking that will find your subject's eyes and lock on. Many cameras can be customized to set this function to a specific button on your camera. And if you use eye autofocus on AFC, it will track the subject's eyes as they move around in the scene. And then when you're ready to capture the moment, click and it'll be sharp. Next, you might want to use manual focus for precision. In low light or macro shots, switching to manual focus and using focus peaking can be a game changer. This is more for stationary subjects and best done on a tripod. In contrast, for fast-moving subjects, you might consider pre-focusing on the location you want to capture your subject moving through the frame. Then you can use high-speed drive and your subject will be sharp when they're in that spot. So as they go through the spot, click, 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 and then they're sharp when they're in that location. Next up, let's talk about camera settings. The exposure triangle settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, play a part in mastering sharpness. I'll talk about them briefly here in this video, but if this is something you need to understand better, check out our other video on the topic here. When it comes to aperture, here are some general rules of thumb. Avoid the extremes. Shooting wide open, like f1.2 or f1.4, can look dreamy, but often results in razor-thin depth of field. Using f2.8, 4, 5.6 usually gives sharper results. This is especially important for something like group shots, where you want multiple people to be sharp. Most lenses' maximum sharpness is somewhere between f4 and f8, and you can look up your specific lens and what its maximum sharpness is. For landscape shots, go narrower. If you want everything in focus, f8, f11 is your sweet spot. Just don't go too far past f16, diffraction kicks in and reduces sharpness. If you want to use that low aperture because you're looking for that extreme bokeh, you'll want to ensure your subject is sharp by using eye autofocus like we talked about in the last section, or using some of the techniques we'll talk about in the practical tips section. Getting blurry shots, your shutter speed is probably too slow. It's either camera shake or motion blur of your subject. For camera shake, follow the reciprocal rule. Your shutter speed should be at least 1 over the focal length to avoid motion blur. So if you're shooting with a 100mm lens, you need at least 1 over 100 seconds shutter speed. For moving subjects where you're concerned about motion blur, start at 1 over 500 seconds or faster to freeze the action. The faster the action, the faster the shutter speed you need. Race cars require a much faster shutter speed than someone just walking around. On that note, don't use silent shutter on fast-moving subjects. It will read line by line and you'll end up getting a wonky look on some of your photos. If you're shooting handheld, it can be good to play it safe, and if in doubt, bump up the shutter speed or adjust the ISO to compensate. If you need to shoot slower shutter speeds, use a tripod and a 2-second timer. And lastly, high ISO introduces noise, which can make an image look less sharp. So use the lowest ISO possible. Start at ISO 100 and only raise it when necessary. Know a comfortable ISO range for your camera as it varies from camera to camera. And use noise reduction wisely. Too much noise reduction can make your image look soft. So in review of the exposure settings, we want to avoid the aperture extremes. Or if we are shooting at a low aperture, we're going to make sure that we're tack-sharp on our subject. We're going to pay attention to shutter speed as it applies to camera shake or motion blur. And if we're shooting handheld, we're going to be more careful with that than if we're using a tripod. And then when it comes to ISO, we want to keep our ISO as low as possible to avoid introducing extra noise into our images. Let's move on to getting the best out of your camera lens. Not all lenses are created equal, and even great ones have their quirks. So find your lens's sweet spot. As I was saying before, most lenses are sharpest 2 stops down from wide open. So a 2.8 lens might be sharpest around 5.6. You'll also want to avoid super cheap filters. Low quality UV filters can kill sharpness. So if you don't need it, take it off. And use high quality glass. Prime lenses and professional zooms tend to be sharper than those entry-level kit lenses. If you are using a kit lens, this might be one of the reasons your photos aren't as sharp as you want them to be. Be sure to subscribe because I'm going to dive deeper into getting the sharpest photos with any lens in an upcoming video. Let's move on to camera stability. Even the best camera settings won't help if your camera isn't stable. So if you're shooting handheld, use proper technique. Brace your elbows in rather than bouncing out here. Hold your breath slightly and press the shutter gently versus pressing the shutter and letting the whole camera move. With a nice camera, you can get sharp images up to 1/5 of a second shooting handheld if you practice and are really good at it. Know your comfort and skill level. I know Mark and I have different comfort levels in terms of our handheld shooting. If you need to shoot at slower shutters, use a tripod. This is a must for long exposures or landscapes. A 2-second timer also helps because you can press the shutter and then remove your hand and it will take the photo 2 seconds later, and that will eliminate any possible shake from you pressing the shutter. You'll also want to make sure you turn on image stabilization. If your lens or camera has stabilization, it can counteract those minor shakes. Let's move on to post-production. Shoot in RAW and sharpen in post. Even if you nail everything in camera, a little post-processing can make your images pop. Shooting in RAW retains maximum detail and dynamic range so that you can sharpen in Lightroom or Photoshop. Use the detail panel and add sharpening without overdoing it. Overdoing it can make it look pretty bad. And remember, you don't have to sharpen the whole image. You can focus on the important areas and sharpen your subject to draw the eye there. Finally, let's talk about some practical tips you can try to help sharpen your images. I've already talked about back button focus, and while it takes some getting used to, I think this is very effective to consistently get sharp images. Next, it's always easier to focus on something with contrast. Taking a picture of a white wall, for example, can be really hard. So look for a picture frame or something to give your camera something to latch onto. The same goes for a blue sky. You might pick a cloud instead. This is especially important in low light conditions, which will be the subject of my next video in this series. But for something tricky like astrophotography, we might manually focus and then take a few test shots to make sure it's perfect before setting up a long exposure. And in general, don't be afraid to take multiple shots. If you know you're shooting something tricky that has low contrast, you can adjust focus and shoot again, adjust focus and shoot again, taking a few shots so that statistically you'll get one that nails it. I use this for something tricky for a bride's ring shot where her hand's on somebody's shoulder. It's hard to tell the camera what it's looking for because the ring is so small. But I want that soft focus right on that ring, so I'll take multiple shots. The other option is to use manual focus, which can be slower. In conclusion, sharp photos don't happen by accident. It's all about knowing where to focus, how to set up your camera, and how to process your images for best results. It's about knowing the limits of your gear. Which of these tips do you find the most useful and which ones do you need more help with? Be sure to drop a comment below and let me know if you identified your sharpness problem. Be sure to subscribe to be notified when the next videos in this series drop. I look forward to diving deeper into this subject with you. Next up, check out my video on mastering manual mode. I'll see you over there.